The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. Great to have you with us again, and great to have my co-host, Elliot Turner, and a very special guest today. I believe you will enjoy this conversation and learn so much from it. I am excited for this. Elliot will introduce our guest, so over to you, Elliot.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Today, we have Doug O'Loughlin with us. He's of Mule's Musings, Fabricated Knowledge, and now SemiAnalysis. I probably should have said Fabricated Knowledge first, but that is what it is. Doug is an awesome person. I feel like I know him, even though we've never actually sat down in person. We've talked so many times, done it on Zoom and everything else. And it's been incredible to watch Doug take like a very strong initial insight as a generalist and become one of the smartest, sharpest specialists in an area. So when Doug's not analyzing businesses, you can maybe find him hiking the Continental Divide Trail. And I think he's got a special knack for like taking this industry, making it really accessible to us all generalists now in the content side of things. And I'm really excited to have Doug here today. So thank you for joining us, and looking forward to what we cover here.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you, Elliot. Definitely feel like I've known you for so long. I mean, we've chatted about names and specific things and all kinds of industries for years now. So yeah, definitely we've chatted quite a bit about companies along the way. So let's just kind of dive into it. I guess let's kind of start with where you want to have some questions, and I'll let you direct the flow of it because I could talk about all aspects of this space forever. Let's kind of start there.
So yeah, I want to talk a lot about AI and data center, but first I want to cover this theme that I've been wrestling with myself, and I think it sets a good backdrop for everything that's happening in the semi space. But in the semi industry, there are basically like two completely contrasting stories going on right now. AI is incredible. It's this major driver of demand. You're seeing it benefit numerous companies. But basically everything else is in a severe downturn, like one of the worst we've seen in the space. So like, how do you see that tension from your seat?
Yeah, so there's some context there that's really important. One, I think it's mostly because I'll briefly touch AI. I'll kind of go to analog and everything else, and I'll kind of come back. First and foremost, one of the reasons why AI is so hot and everything else is so cold is because I think at least let's put the winner in perspective. Nvidia, right? Nvidia is done an amazing job of really focused on where it has massive differentiation and doesn't play in anything else. So just like classic competitive advantage. They are able to increase so much more price and specifically have so much more benefit to them without having massive benefit to their partners. Like it isn't this whole ecosystem wide thing. In a lot of ways, they have many, many moats around their closed gardens. And so they specifically have had this massive outsized impact. And that's kind of percolating to a few other players, namely Broadcom and Marvell. But this isn't your semiconductors of old, right? They're very custom. There are supply chains that help them, but because of the large order size, the people who are associated with them have relatively lower margins, relatively smaller orders. So let's kind of that's the AI side, right? There's been a lot of differentiation, so there hasn't been quite as much breadth to everyone else that isn't an extremely differentiated winner. Now, the rest of the market is in this extreme downturn, but we also have to have the context of why it's in this downturn, right? It's because there was an extreme upturn during 2020. So what happened was, and let's walk all the way back. In 2020, we couldn't have cars anymore because we ran out of semiconductors, and people began to realize how critical these chips are for every aspect of our lives. I would argue most of the capacity additions in 2020, a lot of them happened at the leading edge, but a much larger percentage compared to history, we're at the lagging edge. And so all these chips that were pretty unsexy and hadn't had any new capacity built since, let's say, the late 1990s or the early 2000s, had this giant spurt of capacity come online. And with that capacity, and demand was definitely there, but if you add a lot of capacity and anything gets a little softer than that, what happens is, as you know, the market turns. And so that's kind of the story, I think, right now is we are still kind of going through the post-COVID glut. And the reason why it's still a glut is because historically the lagging edge has had a much more stable supply additions, where most of the lagging edge capacity additions were essentially hand-me-down tools from the leading edge. And so adding de novo lagging edge capacity is what really threw the supply-demand part out of whack. And so I think it's really it's actually kind of healthy. I do think the supply, or rather the inventory overhang, has been much longer than I would have expected at this point. But we are, I think, hopefully closer to the end than to the beginning. So yeah, that's kind of the story, I think, between the leading edge, relatively small percentage of TSMC revenue, AI semiconductors, and then everywhere else, which is like the vast majority of wafers shipped, is in a lot more sluggish space, mostly driven by capacity additions.
So it sounds a little like your classic capital cycle story where,
Yep.
yeah, you get this additional capacity, but it's also a demand story, right? So auto was super strong in 2020. Auto's really weak now. So you have demand coming down into all these capacity problems. I'm curious, you said it's going on longer than you've thought, but like, when do you think at this point recovery will start taking shape, and what kind of recovery do you think can and will happen here?
Be a long and ugly U bottom, right? I do think it's and also I want to put some context in that. Let's specifically say automotive. Automotive was one of the cycles that really didn't turn until extremely late. Like, I think you can first in, first out, right? That's a really good way to think about it, because automotive was pretty much the last in, or last into the cycle, and now it's taking a lot of time to roll out. Let's say the automotive downturn really only began in 2024. I remember the Mobileye pre-announcement was like the first big shot across the bow, and then everything incrementally was weaker. It gets a victory lap that I was a little bearish into that, mostly on the China capacity additions. But I think that that's the real story, is that, look, these cycles historically are, let's say, 6 quarters long on average. And every single industry that went through the COVID upturn went through a much longer down cycle than history. And auto was still in an upcycle into late 2023. And so let's say the 6 quarters is kind of 2Q next year, or of 2025. Sorry, we're in 2025, 2Q or 3Q of 2025. And so that kind of makes sense to me, because every single thing that had an elongated cycle has gone through an elongated downturn. And that and we've seen this like very consistently. Like, there's a few laggards, like FPGAs and autos were really hot, and meanwhile the rest of the market was turning. Now FPGAs and autos are, in the dumps, and that just makes sense, right? Like, you can't have these inventory cycles go on forever without some kind of shortage, or sorry, a glut on the other side. And so that's kind of where we're at with automotive. I think industrial is a little harder because of the demand story is extremely weak, right? Like, industrial does have very high correlation to global PMI, and we're seeing that industrial demand specifically is a lot weaker than we initially expected, and also industrial supply is a lot harder to track, right? Automotive still has a few big customers out there, but the industrial customers, like, let's put it this way, like maybe a smart sensing chip in your hand drill, right? That has a long supply chain with thousands of distributors and inventory everywhere. And so I think that the inventory and the tracking of that was a lot harder. And so during the upturn, people overordered a lot harder because there's, thousands of different places that could go. And now we're seeing it in the downturn where there's pockets of inventory everywhere. And so that's kind of where I think let's say the auto and industrial cycle are. The analog, which is, kind of like very highly correlated to both, is maybe a little bit further along in terms of coming out of the trough. And that's like, the players ADI and Texas Instruments and stuff like that. Inventory extremely high, but we're starting to see gradual recovery there. Wanted to make sure I touched on that.
Got it. Yeah, super interesting. I mean, it's hard to like discuss a counterfactual, but basically, had AI not come along when it did, like the whole
Uh,
industry, like the TSMs of the world would really be looking at a pretty tough go of things, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think you can actually, there's a perfect case study to see where, what would have been. UMC and Microchip. Microchip is an IDM, an integrated device manufacturer in the United States. Microchip is actually refusing CHIPS tax money. They're just saying, actually, the capacity that gets added from the subsidy is probably not going to be worth it, even with like 25% off on the tool and let's say like a $100 million grant. It just doesn't make sense for us anymore. And I think that is the ultimate ultimate signpost where you're refusing free money because you're like, actually, I don't think I need this capacity. And UMC, for example, which is I don't know what it stands for. Think of it as the lagging edge TSMC from Taiwan. They are pretty strong in calling out a global glut in demand or in capacity. And part of this, I think, that was maybe underappreciated was the fact that China specifically is the king of lagging edge, right? China is trying to become like the rest of the world and a leading semiconductor company or country rather. And in order to do that, what they did is they started at the beginning. So they started with much older technology and they've been adding massive amounts of capacity. I think most of the capacity that's been added there is strategic and from a top-down level. No one has to make any money, and they're mostly just figuring out how the processes work at all. And so they're just throwing, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of wafers at the problem. But by doing so, they've created massive amounts of excess capacity. And so I think that that's kind of, in a capitalist consideration between supply and demand, you have this one extremely large player who's like, I don't care about this at all. I'm just going to add as much capacity as possible in order for me to learn how to make a chip better. And so that consideration for them is kind of completely blown up the dynamics, I think, on the lagging edge specifically. So yeah, it's really ironic. Like I remember thinking like, oh, lagging edge is going to be so much better in 2021, and fast forward 3 years. I don't think that's the case. Lagging edge is a real supply issue, and I think we probably added enough lagging edge capacity to digest for the next 5 years. And then on top of that, if it goes too well, right, like China will really backfill into the void there. Like all Chinese domestic production has massive incentives to use Chinese semiconductors, and so that's kind of the problem, right? Like you have like let's say a cartel where the bottom player is extremely willing to add capacity, and so you kind of break up the whole thing.
So, yeah, let me ask you these two related questions. Like, is what's needed for the Western world ex China a degree of consolidation amongst the remaining players in order to kind of rationalize supply and get more consolidated demand? Or is it about, and I guess relatedly, does this become even better for kind of lagging edge fabless chip companies who, TSM's really busy taking care of their most important leading edge customers? Do you start getting like better access, better capacity, better cost structure for some of the fabless companies?
So that's a really interesting point, but actually, I want to point out the supply, or sorry, the industry structure dynamics there. So first on the consolidation point, we've seen consolidation on the lagging edge happen secularly. Like this has been happening. There's a really good chart from I want to say On Semi that I don't know if they publish it anymore, but it used to be like how many semiconductor companies. I want to say it was like hundreds, and now it's like we're in the tens. Okay, it's been a long-term secular story of buying your competitor and rationalizing your supply, and then pushing price and not needing as many people to design. So that was a story that already was happening. I would say this definitely accelerates it. But on the flip side, I think the United States government, as well as international companies, are not willing to let semiconductor companies bid for each other. That's also like a relatively new thing. I think since the Xilinx deal, there hasn't been a deal done, and every single deal has been blocked. Like Tower Semi got blocked by Intel. ARM obviously got blocked. I would say the under of a deal going through, it's extremely unlikely at this point. So I think it would happen if it could, but the reality of geopolitics is making that extremely unlikely. Now, if we're talking about fabless at the lagging edge, that is a really interesting point that I actually want to point out that there really isn't many fabless at the lagging edge. A lot of the lagging edge players let's say like a 32-bit MCU player that makes at like at like 90 nanometer chips or 45 nanometer chips or something like that. More often than not, they own the capacity, they own the fab, and then they also own the device. They're an IDM. So like the ST micros, the microchips, the Texas Instruments, they more often than not, they are, they do have some fab light strategy, meaning that, like, let's say Texas Instruments, I think, makes about 70% of their stuff internal. You can go look up the actual numbers on the website. I don't know the actual off the top of my head, but over time, what they've done is they're trying to have more internal. So they're kind of integrated as is. But historically, what these companies have done is they've actually only used TSMC or UMC when they need to. And so I don't know. I would argue, yeah, that definitely helps them. But all the big consumers who are quote unquote fabless, like, don't really exist, or they already have some amount of their capacity is internal. So there's like kind of this that's kind of like a constraint that I think is important. Is the industry structure for the lagging edge is very different than the industry structure for the leading edge, because there's different constraints. Like leading edge design costs billions of dollars. Like it costs like a multi-billion dollars to get a 3 or 2 nanometer tape out. Just the amount of EDA tools, the people you have to hire, all the testing, the verification, the IP that you have to use from other vendors, it's extremely costly. That dynamic does not exist on the lagging edge. You can use a relatively small team to spin up a relatively old chip. And so it doesn't make sense to really split the design versus the fab, because the design part of the equation is so small. It doesn't, you might as well in-house it. So there's like an industry structure difference that you have to consider for, like, the advantageousness of being a lagging edge fabless company.
So when we talk about everything that's not AI, like these lagging edge companies in general, I'll leave semicap maybe a little separate, but the stocks, are they deservedly punished to reflect what has been a severe downturn? Or do you think there's a degree to which AI is kind of sucking the air out of everything else in the space?
I think it is. Okay, so there's two parts to that question, right? The AI sucking every air out of everything else in the space, and then versus like how bad are the lagging edge. I think, okay, so AI is definitely sucking everything out of the space, first and foremost, right? We have to acknowledge that, right? Like I would say, you can argue that pretty much every single, like, let's say, marginal company is trying to push for a big AI content story. Like a good example maybe is Infineon. Infineon is historically known as this like ginormous European automotive semiconductor company, and they're really really excited about like an AI power content story, right? Like so that's a good example where these lagging edge guys are, who's historically been focused on something else, are very starting to focus on AI as well. You can even argue there's a lot of players who kind of fit that bill. So there definitely is some aspect where even the lagging edge players are really focused on AI because of all the incremental content growth, and that makes sense. So pretty much, if you're a player that isn't participating, you're punished on a multiple basis, and if you are, you have some kind of incremental content story, you're rewarded. And so the more you get to that, the better your stock trades. But I do think that there is, I historically love to be a bottom feeder in terms of semiconductor cycles, because as sure as it is in the dark, there's like this really great quote from the microchip CEO who just stepped back in, is like, it's never as bad as you think in the darkest hours. It's obviously never as good as you think in the upturn. In the upturn, you're like, wow, we'll never hit this demand, right? It doesn't matter how much capacity I add. We'll never ever be able to hit the orders that we're getting. And obviously you're being double ordered. And then, it could be literally 4 quarters later, you're like, wow, we are never going to fill our fab, right? Like we're totally screwed. We're never going to get rid of this inventory. And so that pendulum always shifts. And right now, I think not only is the pendulum, we're never going to get rid of this inventory, but the pendulum also is just disinterest. I think that especially on the like smaller side without an AI story, pretty much has been an area where I think no one even cares anymore. I would argue that I definitely am like the type of person to play in the, or like care about the smaller names. And even I'm struggling to have interest. So I do think there's like a lot of opportunity. Some of these companies I think are getting so cheap that strategics feel like pretty warranted. And I just, yeah, I just think that right now no one cares, right? Like automotive is so dead, it's so over. Who could care about an automotive story? Meanwhile, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, everyone was talking about like an automotive 15% revenue CAGR till 2030, and it was the most secular, most advantaged part of the semiconductor cycle, right? So you have to like, the narrative shifts very quickly, and I candidly can't look at the narrative and be like, wow, interest rates are so high, and they're so no one's buying cars, and the economy, is it on or is it off again? Like all these kind of stuff. But I in my heart of hearts, I know that in 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 quarters, at some point the cycle always turns. And when that happens, from extremely low inventories, you have to have orders to backfill it. And then all of a sudden, you're looking at extremely strong revenue growth for companies that trade relatively, very modest, multiples. And you can be like, wow, that actually is an amazing opportunity. These are, obvious longs. And I think that you have to be interested and wake up and stay in the game when no one cares, because that's like the thing that will happen on the other side. So, I mean, we're seeing some pretty, I actually just got back from vacation, but like we're seeing some pretty drastic moves, and especially in automotive, like it's very much giving it's over. No one's gonna ever buy a car again, right? Like meanwhile, someone will have to buy a car eventually. So that's just kind of my intuition is, especially in the automotive world, things are extremely bombed out.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Like the way that narratives have the narrative pendulum is swung from so enthusiastic to depressed. It's the way Mr. Market works, and it's the reason why Clayton Christensen wrote The Innovator's Dilemma about the semi industry, right? It's where things move fastest, and these are the
Yep.
high frequency parts of it. Um, but when you're trying to size up from an investment perspective, some of these bombed out areas, are there any kind of like global screening criterion or just like frameworks or mental models that you could apply to say like, company A is better than company B rather than just trying to call a turn in the cycle itself?
So that's a good question. I, hilariously enough, have been spending so much time on each company. I feel like I understand the shape of what their differentiation is. So I don't usually think about like a really simplistic heuristic. Like, I mean, I think the thing that I think of over and over again is, and like especially in semiconductor world, is like, I know this is like kind of lame. I sort things by RSI. Okay, like what is the most oversold? What's the most overbought? Right. I just look at what's the most oversold with a story that I understand is secular and their positioning is decent, and that's like historic. And like, I also would love to be really timely with where they are in the cycle, and then understanding like, I think that like, let's say quality on semiconductors specifically is kind of based on their products and their SKUs and who their customers are. So and then also I would like say free cash flow. Like let's give some examples, and just like, let's say automotive semi X, like the analog guys. I would say it's like ST Micro, Infineon, On Semi. I think I'm probably, and NXPI. So I think one of the ways you should think of quality is like who's actually made free cash flow of the cycle, right? Like that's a really important thing. So for example, STM, no matter how much you and like I really can't explain how weird of STM is as like a company sometimes. Earnings, great. Free cash flow, not so good. They really don't make that much cash flow, right? And that's like, that's the bottom line of what makes a company valuable to you. On, I would argue, has historically been in that same bucket where they really never made that much free cash flow. Now, there's been this new CEO, Hassan, who's really done a really good job of turning around the company, and I cannot explain how hot of a hand he's had. He's literally like played every single hand perfectly. He moved to sell off like his lowest margin business when during the upcycle, and so now the down cycle's come and he doesn't have the lowest margin business. He bought like a silicon carbide fab for like pennies on the dollar out of bankruptcy, and it's been working really well. He's done all these really good moves, and so I think that that's an example where like historically that thing's traded with STM and it should deserve a premium, right? Like there is a premium for people who are good at operating the cycle. Then you have like NXPI and Infineon, who are like the much bigger, solid giants in the space, and they consistently make free cash flow. They consistently buy back shares. Probably like much less risky, and they're like they're not weaving through the traffic lanes quite as much. So I think that that's kind of my framework at least, like free cash flow and how much they make over the cycle is probably like the biggest indication of quality, right? Like because everyone's going to lose money or maybe get like less profitable at some point. But if you're consistently doing a higher watermark than everyone else, it tells you that you have the right cost structure in place. And I think consistently the ones who are the worst actors in the space really don't make that much money along the way.
At the end of the day, cash is king. And I think that's really interesting. And those are some great examples. I know I said AI sucking the air out of everything, but maybe let's give AI the air it deserves. And you were like really early identifying how big this would be. I think even before AI emerged, one of the ways we'd met was over this idea, Infi, and you were really keyed in on the data center and some of the biggest bottlenecks in making data centers work better and faster, which is basically like one of the most important stories today.
Yeah, still is.
Still is, right? And we'll get to the specifics. We'll get to those kinds of questions. But I want to ask you the provocative high level question first on AI. So, like, people give the .com, specifically the fiber build out comp, and kind of say, like, oh, this is all crazy. Like, what do you think when you hear that?
Like the fiber build for this round specifically?
Yeah, that today is just like .com, where Nvidia is the Cisco of Y2K. um and that we're kind of like repeating the same thing predicated on this massive hype around AI. Like, how do you react to that?
Yeah,
What do you think?
So this is the very 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 big question, right? I don't know, and I've actually written. I feel like I've written so dang much on this now. I don't really know. I think that there's many levels to this, right? Like capital cycles are important. It does seem pretty clear to me that our current data center infrastructure is just like completely not fit for what is the job to be done, right? We really are at this point where, and you can argue, and like a lot of the arguments for some of the big capex expenditures was like, yeah, I know we overlaid the fiber, but how did Facebook only worked because we had so much excess capacity, right? Great. So I think the capacity that is being added is needed, but the problem is, I think of it less as like, oh, it's a clear bubble versus it's a supply and demand line that are trying to find the equilibrium, right? We know demand is large. We understand that we need to invest in supply to meet said demand, but we don't understand really where the demand line is, right? Like it's far away from supply, and it's growing, but so is supply. Supply is like as like capitalism, supply, and the ingenuity of people is like almost a limitless source of new innovation, right? Like pretty much in the same way the telecom boom happened, like there was supply, right? It wasn't doubling every 100 days, but people did want to use a lot more internet. And so the entire industry got really smart on how to add more and more and more supply. And that's kind of what we're going through today. Like we clearly have a lot of demand from AI. Like the models are just orders and orders and orders of magnitude more compute intensive than what we needed, right? Like let's kind of take the Web 2.0 version of the market, right? Like fetching a data like using Facebook, right, was just essentially like, hey, there's a database on the other side that says here's your post, and if someone liked it or not, you literally just fetch that piece of data and it comes back, and then it shows if it's a like or not a like or whatever status they had on the screen. That is trivial amounts of compute. Like a CPU can do that. Kingdom come, like one small core in a big CPU can host tens and tens and thousands of these requests back and forth. Completely trivial. Versus what we're doing with AI is we're running through these like billions of parameters, tons of data, all this stuff, like finding all the latent spaces and like all the little relationships between all this data. It is just inherently much more complicated and much more intensive. Like I hate to use this analogy, but it's like one is like a horse. You feed it some grass and it goes really far. The other is like actually where it's like a train. You have to do all the infrastructure. You can go tens and tens and tens of miles. It's orders of magnitude more efficient. Like you're able to move so much more power. It just costs so much more. But at the same time, so does the GPUs. The GPUs are 100x improvement over CPUs. The networking is 8x improvement in scaling out all this stuff. And so this supply demand relationship is we blindly add supply until we hit the demand curve that we don't know or see or understand. And so at some point it crosses. And when that crosses, it's like it's all over, right? And so that's how I think about this whole process, because I think it's not, I don't think it was, and like let's even look at like old capital cycles, right? Like railroads. I don't think it was unreasonable to add all the railroads onto, into North America when there were frontier towns, right? Was it unreasonable how the speculative bubble that happened around them? Yes, 100%. Speculating on land value during that part and process, probably extremely unreasonable, and was one of the things that made it such a bad bubble. Same with telecom, right? Like I think and I literally just wrote about this, is like, I think the thing that is like kind of weird to me that we're missing is there's a difference between like needing capital and building a capital cycle versus a bubble. And I think one of the things that I like identify with, at least based on history, is like, we don't have this like extremely fast feedback loop that we did in the telecom bubble, right? When essentially WorldCom said, "Hey, we're adding a new wired connection to another country," the stock would go up 30%, and so you'd be like, "Oh, clearly it's very valuable," right? Like there's that completely quick feedback loop that it's extremely valuable to have all this supply growth. That's not happening in the markets. Like we're not seeing a company say, "Hey, we just got 100 megawatts," and the stock goes up 30%, right? Because if you had that fast feedback loop, I think it would create like the like that's like the important mechanism of a bubble. Like it loops in on itself so that you reward capacity additions at all costs. And today, I think we're not quite there, right? We really have, let's say, 5 extremely large players who are adding capacity. They're all self-funded on this capacity. They're not raising from external markets, right? They're not raising, billions and billions of dollars of debt. And yeah, maybe they're adding too much capacity. Maybe the ROIC doesn't end up being quite as good as it was, but I do think they will make a return on said capital. Now, is it going to be their historical monopoly, like internet monopoly level profits where they're making, high 50-60% ROICs? Probably not. This is just much more capital intensive. But are they making 0% ROICs? Are they just throwing away money? I don't really think so. And so that's kind of the part that I really struggle with, is I do think but maybe the part where it's like a little bit harder to understand is the adoption, right? Because you have these expensive models. They're extremely valuable. I use them every single day. I'm sure you are, or you should, candidly. There's so much data you can, like, it really does help with information processing. And the business models are not really clear to me. Like, how do you convert capacity and supply into a business model where you make revenue and money on the other side? It's clear that there's demand for it. ChatGPT is a top 10 website, and there's probably going to be, I don't think there's billions of users. There's hundreds of millions of users. There's probably a billion free users. Like people use it all the time and they're willing to pay. Does that support the CapEx involved? I don't know, right? There is demand. I don't know if the supply is too much or too little. I think it's very, very hard for any of us to prospectively understand that. Sorry if that was an extremely long ramble.
That was long, but super helpful. And I think it's really interesting, and I'd reflect back on your point about supply crosses demand. I think part of what, if I were to maybe try to think of two things at the same time for myself and how to think about this, one thing that you're saying, this is a one-time build out to meet something brand new. And what's brand new is created massive demand, and we need the supply to service all that demand. And in fact, as we create supply, we are in some areas creating new demand because capabilities go up and people keep coming at this with more. On the at the same time, not really on the other hand kind of thing. At the same time, also because this is very new, I mean, your first models are being served with data centers that were not built for AI. But today, now that we know this is the thing, companies are kind of building to suit, and I guess simultaneously still tinkering with exactly how to service this AI demand.
Yep.
So like there is a degree to which we kind of have to modernize our infrastructure while also creating the supply to match this demand. How long do you think this process will take to play out? I know it's a really hard question. And like, do you think some of the early winners might seed way to a new round of winners? Some companies maybe who are kind of like building to suit, or do you think like hyperscalers doing their own chips will start taking increasingly more share from Nvidia? Like, What do you think in general about how I'm trying to sum up what you've laid out in some ways?
I guess the early people who are deploying capacity, is that correct? Like,
Yep.
so man, it's a complicated question. Many different ways to think about it. I do think there's this like really interesting thing, and obviously, I don't just write for myself, Fabricated Knowledge, or like help with semi-analysis. That I think we've talked a lot about is that the deployment of late chips is actually like there's this aspect on the GPU curve, so they look kind of like shale. You make insanely high IRRs if you're early, and then as the well continues, you make most of your cash up front in a very short amount of time, and then it decays really quickly. So I think that alone makes a good argument that if you're a late deployer to a GPU, right, and this is just GPU versus GPU, not including the custom silicon aspect of it, right? You usually make really good returns, but if you're a late adopter, it's pretty bad. Like there's definitely this aspect of chicken, right? Like I would not take an H100 and rent it in the market today. I don't think you're gonna have a good time, especially over a 4 or 5 year depreciable life. Like you will, I don't think it's gonna be a good time for anyone involved, if that's your business model. But if you have a GB200 and you're within the first 6 months, you're going to make some super profits. And so there's that consideration that like the cost curve on the supply side is very dynamic, right? Each incremental new generation of supply that gets added is so superior to the old. It kind of makes it makes the capacity planning extremely tricky, and that's something that's I don't even know how that kind of shakes out in this market. It's very, very nuanced and complicated. But then, and so that's just talking about the GPU side. On the custom silicon side, there is this really interesting dynamic there that I don't know if that's like, the end all be all, right? Like I think people think that, oh, well, now that Amazon has Trainium 2, it's so good and so cheap because they Amazon basiced it, and it's going to be much better than Nvidia's product. I would argue that if the gross margins were equal, and like this is like Porter's competitive advantage, like really way back in the book. If the gross margins were equal, I know Nvidia would be a better product, right? Like, the only way this works is because the gross margins are not equal, and the custom silicon guys are willing to do like kind of a private, like this is a private label brand. This is a private label, AI accelerator for a hyperscaler. But if everything else were equal, I think I think the TSMC Nvidia relationship and just technological domination wins out. Like truly, AMD is a good example of this. Like the AMD MI300, right? It's a much faster rated spec. SemiAnalysis is this amazing piece that, like, in reality, it's very hard for you to hit the rated spec because the software just doesn't support it. And so, but the difference is AMD literally is like half the price and twice the cost, to the point where it's like, one company is making 70s or 80%. I think H100s are like 80% gross margins, right? AMD's is like 40s, 50s gross margin, and it's a worse product, right? So I think that level of competitive dynamics is really important. And you can argue that is, like Google probably is in, like the Google TPU for Broadcom is probably in the 50s, right? Custom silicon's kind of in that range. Maybe higher because it's Broadcom. But if gross margins were equal, I don't know. I'm not very convinced that it would be so obvious that the custom silicon product would be better. So I think that is something you should keep an underwrite right underneath, is like if Jensen really wanted to, he would just drop prices and kill his competition. Like that's what makes it competitive, and that's like, competitive dynamics in the market. But realistically, it's a performance advantage, and he's the only merchant solution. So you should lead with price. And what that trade-off on price kind of looks like is up to him to decide to kind of maximize his value and his part of the market. I don't think the Nvidia relationship and market share should continue, right? Like, let's say in late 2023, probably the percentage of flops deployed that were AI accelerators was like 95% Nvidia, right? Like that's a monopoly, right? That's just not how that works, right? And if you're the big customer, you want a second source. Like imagine if we're on Amazon.com and there's, the Amazon Basics brand, and then there's the primary brand. More often than not, I think the primary brand, being Nvidia, is going to probably still have the vast majority of the revenue. Like I think you look in history in semiconductor products, you kind of end up in this weird, like, and this is like, maybe this is just pure pattern recognition, but I see it over and over and over. Let's say it's a 2-person market, I would say it's like 60-40. Let's say it's a 3-person market, I would say it's 60-30-10. Something like that is probably the natural state of where things should be. But we have this adjustment period to get from, the 90-10 to the 70-30 or something like that. And so I think what will happen is Nvidia will continue to dominate and lead with the best, full stop. Like they're pushing the edge of what is possible. The 224 G30s, which probably is over the head of the context of this podcast, is like they did a world first. Oh my God, they did. They're doing world first all the time, and they are pushing the best possible chips possible. And yeah, they deserve a price premium. Now, the Amazon Basics version of this, which is like the Amazon, like literally Trainium, right? They are not doing world first with their PCIe interconnect, okay? But they are able to offer, like a 70 or 80% solution for much cheaper. And so that's kind of like but that's the negotiating tactic, right? You have to have another option. Otherwise, if there was no other option, Jensen would just price and price and price and price, and you would just have to sit there and eat it. So having a second source needs to happen in order for you to have like a relatively healthy market. Everyone wants a second source, even if it isn't perfect, right? You have to have something that isn't all Jensen's. So and AMD really isn't doing that. So the custom silicon projects are, I think, the real second source to Nvidia.
So I mean, I think you made a really profound point in leading off that answer. The idea that AMD is half the price and twice the cost. So you're saying it's effectively like you can't brute force your way with more chips to a better outcome because it literally costs you more to operate that chip. So you're losing any advantage. Even if chip for chip, AMD were able to match the total output, technically speaking. Maybe talk a little more about like how Nvidia is in this advantage position in cost of ownership, and I guess relatedly, can the hyperscalers, given their building to suit their specific needs and how they build and define their own data centers, can the hyperscalers back themselves into a better total cost of ownership with their own chips, knowing exactly what they need, or can Nvidia just keep delivering advantage chips to the market?
I mean, it's really hard to answer this question, right? There is always a different there's always a different optimization, right? There is some optimization you can make that you're not aware of. So yes, maybe a hyperscaler can push all in one direction or another. But I think the easiest way to think about this though is like, what is the most differentiated, hardest part about solving the puzzle, right? It's not data center design. It's not the models, I would argue, it's not even that, right? Like you scale up something relatively simple to something infinitely large, right? I think it's semiconductor design. Like semiconductor design and making a system is extremely hard. And there really is only a few players who really do it super duper duper well. And so when you make that bet of, is it the hyperscaler who can have a build to suit in their own data center TCO thing, but are they really optimizing at like what is the bleeding problem to be solved versus, is the chip the more differentiated thing? I would argue it's the chip that's way more differentiated. Like making a chip is way, 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 way hard. It's much harder than making a data center, right? Making your special sauce data center isn't really going to solve for the fact that your chip is slower. Now, making your special sauce data center with like a special sauce power, maybe you can shove enough chips in it that you can kind of hit some parity. But I think the innovation that happens at the nanoscale level is much, much, much harder. And I think that every single one of those has much bigger leverage. And then on top of that, Nvidia is definitely like pushing up outside of it's just the chip, right? Like the system is very important thing. Jensen has been saying this, right? Like, the rack is the new GPU, the data center is the unit of compute. And so I think pretending like Jensen doesn't know this and hasn't been pursuing this is like, I think it's like naive to think that like they're like the hyperscalers know it so much better. I don't think that's the case. They have a big spending budget and are clearly the customers, but Jensen was the guy who came up with the concept of doing the copper rack interconnect to make this like the most cost efficient power scale out within like a certain size. The hyperscalers are copying that design, right? And so as long as you push innovation, that is going to really be the way you create value, right? You push the innovation, you create a technical outcome that has literally never been done before and just is so much better on a power to performance basis that you demand price. And if the hyperscalers can compete like that, sure, I would say, yeah, go to town. Hyperscalers can win it all. But realistically, the hyperscalers are Amazon, they're the basics version of what's already been done. They are the second, I actually, let's put a big asterisk. Google does not. Google's TPU is different. Google's TPU is actually pretty differentiated. I think they do have a really, like, they've been doing this process and scale out for a long time. They do a lot of innovative things. I would say, like, truly, the one issue with Google is it's kind of like a vertically integrated thing. Like, it really is dependent on them pushing out the product well as well, right? Like, you have to believe in Google's ability to ship an LLM as well as its silicon, right? So that it's almost fragile because of all the interlinkages. But Nvidia's pushing, and I think that, like, yeah. So when you ask, like, oh, can they do the build to suit? Technology does win. And so I think that that's the consideration, right? Like, if they could push out a technological solution that is much better on a TCO basis, sure. But the one who's been writing the playbook the entire time has been Jensen and the team at Nvidia. So you have to believe that they stop, and I don't think they will. So I think that that's the consideration, right? Like, so yeah, I'm sorry if that's a really long-winded way to answer that, but I think that that's the correct framing.
That's really interesting. And like Google, right? So they're building their TPU on using Broadcom's services. And
Yep.
it seems like Broadcom, I mean, late in 2024, they became the next $1 trillion company. Some people even started calling it the Mag 8, not the Mag 7.
I think it's the
With
grade eight. That's the
sorry, the grade 8 makes it sounds a lot better than Mag 7. That's right. Um, like, why is Broadcom the one winning this business in this way? And can any other companies help lead kind of like a Nvidia alternative into the market, bring Nvidia alternative into the marketplace that's I mean, maybe closely viable?
So in this consideration, let's kind of talk about what is the hyperscalers using them for and what they're not using them for. So Google, and I think Amazon, I'm not completely sure. This is a good Dylan question, probably not a Doug question. Like, the front end design is relatively tight and easy to do, meaning that, like, designing the logic chips and the gates and stuff like that and like the RTL and like all this stuff to make a really high end chip on the front end is not that hard. I mean, you can go hire a crack team of people. You can really, like, it's a job to be done that's pretty easy to define and hire and get to where you want to go. But all the other stuff of making a chip really hard as well. And so, once you have, your core logic units on a chip, you're like, okay, well, now they need to talk to each other, right? So they have to have IO, very important, very hard. They have to scale out. They have to have really good verification and tests. They have to have the supply chain. They have to have, I don't think TSMC is going to show, if you show up and have an order for, like, 100,000 chips and you've never brought a chip to production before, they're going to be like, okay, maybe. But, like, the chip to production aspect and, like, getting, there's a whole industry very focused on, like, after you design the chip, it does exactly what it says, right? Like, that is an extremely hard thing. And so ironically, you'd think this extremely sexy front end design is really hard, but it's actually the whole mega chip that's really much harder. So, like, let me use a finance analogy, right? Like, in theory, you can go hire a team to make your new pod shop work really well. You understand who to hire. There's a few people who are really good. They're CFAs. They've been in other seats like this. You give them just the tools they need to succeed, whether if it's like Bloomberg and like the data services and all that, and they can put a portfolio into place. That's pretty well defined and easy to understand. Definitely not easy to do well, right? What's really hard is to scale it up to billions and billions and billions of dollars. And I'm gonna use the long short model specifically because I do think it's like a very interesting product as anyways. But, like, scaling up to billions of dollars, having risk teams, having understanding, like, how to leverage it without, like, messing it up in the market, all these, like, really knock on complicated things to make the bigger products possible. That is kind of like the analogy here. to what Broadcom is doing for Google, right? Like Google has the front end team and design. They have the people, in the pod shop who's able to, show that they have alpha, but like to make it scalable into a platform and to have billions of chips on time in production at system level, all tested, all that kind of stuff. There is something else they need. And then IO is extremely, extremely hard and super differentiated, and Broadcom is better at it than anyone else. And so that's, I think, where Broadcom really shines, is that it's one thing to make a chip. It's another thing to put them all together to talk to each other, to put them all together to talk to each other on a bigger rack. And you have to do it on a single rack. You have to do it in a data center level. All of that expertise, you have to understand every aspect of it. And there's only so many people who do that. And Broadcom is one of the people who does it best, right? Because don't forget, they have this switch business, right? That often talked about as like all the AI customs accelerator, but like the switch business, they've essentially been number one share since like the early thousands. And I don't think, no matter how many new competitors or innovators, they still have like this 80-20 share. They just continue to kick the shit out of the market. And they are, they're the 1,000-pound gorilla there. And Marvell actually is another player who bought one of the challengers, who tried it, and is actually has some pretty strong IO stuff, but it's just not like that tier one like Broadcom is. And so they're another player who kind of can do that level of sophistication to scale out and roll out to a bigger system than just a single design. And that's why Marvell is definitely the partner to watch for Amazon, right? So and I would consider something as well, as Broadcom is notoriously a very aggressive partner, right? Like we just saw them buy VMware and like 3x price in the course of 4 quarters, right? So we know, I would guess that Broadcom is flexing its pricing power and understands its strategic position relative to Google. And so that's like a consideration I think Marvell has really done a better job of, or that's like kind of their differentiator, is they're like, we're not going to come in and raise prices on you and make sure and kind of inhibit your business because we know what's strategic and we control it and you don't, right? Marvell is trying to be more partnership like, maybe even have lower gross margins, more willing to work and operate with a team, versus Broadcom historically as a company has been known to be pretty ruthless. And so that's like kind of the other big player in the custom silicon space. But they're really it's kind of really interesting because it's very hard for you to get all the expertise to do that. You have to tape out really leading edge chips. You have to have taped out many of them in the past at like true enterprise scale, meaning millions of chips at the leading edge, and you have to be able to have all the IP needed to do that. And I think that really right now the two companies that seem to be qualified to say they can, maybe we'll say 3 as well. I think MediaTek is definitely able to do it as well. Broadcom is definitely able to do it. Marvell is definitely willing to do it. I think Allchip, which is like this Taiwanese design player who kind of does some of this stuff as well, just isn't quite in that tier. Like it's, there's just like this tier of people who are able to do it. So it's very few who are able to do it. I think MediaTek's a good example of someone else. Maybe Qualcomm, if they were, I would even argue like Intel of old, Qualcomm could do it. Like all these guys who have really big infrastructure level, like millions of chips, very high end, very fast. But it's just about the focus and ability to ship the chip that makes that possible. Does that answer your question?
Probably. Absolutely. And I'm glad you invoked Marvell and the company they acquired, which is Inphi, that we mentioned before, and you and I kind of bonded over. And that was related to your identification of interconnect, like I/O, as the problem in the data center that was throttling faster performance. Like, do you still see that is the foremost problem in the data center, or do you think there's like newly emerging problems now that we've shifted far more into the AI than pre-AI world today?
So I think definitely there's some stuff to consider. I would definitely say networking will always be some level of bottleneck, right? But I think the one that is the first and foremost right now, I think, is power for the data center. That is becoming the ginormous bottleneck in the entire supply chain. Like that, I think if you look at the marketplace, you can kind of look and see what people are doing. I don't think 10 years ago, if you told me they recommissioned, Three Mile Island for the new, for the 20, like it's like the, so just, like a nuclear power plant, like essentially, I think it's like a 40-year life with the option to extend another 40. I think they essentially extended another 20. It's like they literally went and said, hey, that nuclear power plant is a half smoked cigarette on the ground. I'm going to buy it. Like that is the level of power that is being done, like the rush for power that's happening in the marketplace. And I think that in the near term, that's probably the true constraint, right? Because this is like a scaling these models and pushing like the technological progress of all this is a many variable problem. And so what happens is, and we've seen this like happen a few times, is like one variable becomes extremely maxed out and becomes the bottleneck. Everyone focuses on fixing it, and boom, it's fixed. Like, at one point in time, you couldn't get an H100. That's very trivial. You can get an H100 now. That's not a big deal. One point in time, there wasn't enough optics, or like you couldn't get the interconnected. Like, no, each of the chip parts can get like knocked down. I think the one part that today we're seeing that's maybe a little different than the past, right? Like the networking and data set and the chip supply chains are relatively elastic. Like they're responsive within 12 months. You can definitely move supply on. The one place that we don't have that, and it's not even close, is power. Power at the data center level has become this ginormous rush. And you can see this between the interconnect rates at like PJM or ERCOT, right? Like they're limit upping pretty much. Like if you have a relatively clean power, honestly, not even clean power, like gas turbine, there's a 3-year backlog for GEV's gas turbines. Like they're taking placements for 2028 right now. There is this ginormous, like this furious scramble for power, and that's become, like, in my opinion, the newest bottleneck, because you can order, I think TSMC could even supply, another 100%, like another order of magnitude more chips of GB200. But I literally think the United States couldn't supply the power to plug them in. And so that's a really interesting thing, and it's much slower. It takes 3 to 5 years to add a power plant. And so we're starting to see regulations kind of deregulize that to make it quicker for the market to catch up, because people are starting to realize like that's becoming the big bottleneck, is power specifically. So yeah, more than happy to talk about that, because that's definitely some place I've been very interested in recently.
Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, you could add more power generating capacity to the grid. On the other hand, are there ways that companies are attacking power from like a technology perspective? It feels like, when I look at my phone, it keeps getting more and more capable, and I feel like battery life continues to kind of deliver. Maybe that's a battery thing, but maybe there's a degree to which chips are becoming more efficient. Like, are there multiple angles of attack here? And are there different kinds of solutions that might be on the horizon?
Yeah, so there are many angles of attack. So like let's just kind of talk about like your chip getting more efficient first. So like one of the things that's definitely become a big thing is actually copper cables are really cheap, and they're really efficient, right? Optics mean you have to essentially change the information from electrical, because all the chips talk in electricity to each other. And then you have to change the electricity into a light, and then you have to push the light over a fiber. It's really efficient to push it over fiber, but if you just never change the signal, it's a lot easier to do. So think about it this way, is like for power specifically, and this is like the big innovation of the GB200, is that like, before, like, and this is Inphi's business, is like you would go drive to the airport, and then you go through security, and then you take the plane. The plane's much faster. But just going through security takes a lot of time and takes a lot of power in this example, right? What if you just could drive and you could just push, you can make a faster car that doesn't have the security and all that kind of stuff. So that's a huge thing. That is like the distance of an active or passive copper cable is like one of the most important constraints in the market right now, because that is an order of magnitude better power. Boom. Very important, right? The other thing I think is just like the types of power. I think there's like, if we're talking about like scaling out to the next level, to the data center, right? There's different power that is like preferable or not. I think the one that's like funny to me is like nuclear power is having a little bit of a moment because of extreme high uptime. Solar actually is kind of weirdly fitted for this, because if you think about and like, let's just think about the constraint of the data center itself, is that you want the chips to be running all the time. They cost so much as a percentage of the data center. Like, if you have the shell, like all that stuff, and you power it, even if you pay like twice the market rate of power, it does not compare to the price of the chips. The chips are the most important, most expensive part of it, and you want to have the utilization of that 100% uptime. Solar is actually not consistent. So solar, for example, if it's a cloudy day, boom, you don't have the power, and now your 100 megawatts that you have, and that's like a huge number. Let's just say, 100 megawatts of power. Maybe it's only 40 megawatts today. That means you literally cannot run the GPUs at the high speed that you want. So uninterruptible power is a huge part of this. Now, there are constraints though, right? Like how clean the uninterruptible power, right? Like natural gas is an example. But then on top of this, and I think this is what you're kind of getting at, is and I also want to spend 4 seconds here saying that SemiAnalysis core research is like our new product that's like focused on financial customers, specifically kind of, and we kind of highlighted this specifically, is this company called Bloom Energy. Bloom Energy is really weird because they are, some investors definitely don't like their historical reputation, but I think what they do is they have batteries at on-site gen. Think of it as another like power bank that sits at the data center, and so it's much more expensive than just buying from the grid. But time to market really matters, right? If you have a GP200 and it's sitting in a warehouse, that's a huge waste of capital. Those things cost millions and millions of dollars, right? So if you're willing to pay 30-40% power premium, which costs you tens of thousands of dollars, you're able to move the time to market closer. And remember when we talked about that previous conversation about shale declines, like the quicker and sooner you have that GPU up in the market, the return profiles are vastly different. So time to market is like the most important thing. And so Bloom Energy, what they have is they have this on-site battery deal, and like AEP is an example they recently did. And so this is a way to like kind of do a hybrid slush model where like on-site generation at Tesla's Memphis thing, or I guess XAI, where they had these gas generators and then they have these battery banks, right? That's one way to kind of increase or kind of get around the grid capacity issues and increase your time to market. And so Bloom is this company where they have this capacity thing where what you can do is now you can buy energy in off hours, right? You can keep that, and you can kind of your load from the grid is going to be much more variable. You're going to be able to increase your time to market. It's going to cost you a lot more, but the capex is heavy, but not the opex. And so that's kind of the thing. And I think that you would find this very interesting. There is actually a meaningful incentive from the insiders to do this. So the AEP deal, which was this AEP is a very large utility where I think. And they did this ginormous deal with Bloom. I think if that works, what's going to happen is the out years for the Bloom's numbers compared to consensus are just like really wrong. Like it's much higher. But not only are they're going to do this AEP deal, the insider, the CEO has this PSU package that's like hyper focused on more of these infrastructure level AI deals and getting as many of them as possible. And I think that that's like a perfect example of like what we see the bull case is them becoming on-site power generation or on-site power storage for a data center. They have the incentives focused. It's like 2% of the company if he really kills it, which is a massive incentive for a multi-billion-dollar company. And they're like the perfect solution in the marketplace because they can actually be a little bit more greener. Now, is it going to be as cheap on a true like-to-like basis as just buying, off the grid at full market rates? No, but will increase your time to market in grids that are completely constrained, which is like most of the grids in the United States. Yes. And so I think they have this like perfect solution to increase the time to market, which will increase the value of your GPUs or your how much money you can make from them in the short term. And yeah, so that's like the Bloom Energy pitch is they have this like very specific niche product that is specifically targeted at solving one of the hardest, most important constraints. And not only that, they have this like massive insider incentive for the CEO to just do this. So if they land, like God forbid, one or two more AEP size deals, this is going to be a totally different company. And I think that's the interesting thing is that the CEO's entire thing is to land one or two of more like that's the explicit language in the PSU. So that's kind of like my favorite, our favorite idea, core, or not our favorite, actually, one of the many ideas that we have at Core Research, right? We definitely, Core Research at SemiAnalysis, that's like what we're calling it. We not only cover the chips level, right? Which I think you guys you can see, right? We're the absolute best at understanding it, the full stack, right? every aspect of the chip, I think we're better at than anyone else in the world. But not only are we doing that, we are focused on AI and everywhere it goes. And I think the key bottleneck being the data center is one of our biggest areas of research right now. I think we pay tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on satellite photos to know who is doing what cluster where. We are doing work around the world to know where all the data are, kind of like what level, how much power density, all this kind of stuff, because these are the real constraints. So we follow the constraint to where is needed. And I think Bloom specifically has this like really interesting time to market solution that is and also a very contentious equity story historically. And so that's kind of one of the interesting companies and stories that we're covering today. But there's there's a lot other than just that. So that's my 40, I guess, like 2 or 3 minute pitch on Bloom Energy.
That is super interesting because, I knew that right when you said the name Bloom Energy, I once was a watch 60 minutes every single week kind of person, recorded it on my DVR. No longer do that, but I remember from when I don't even have a DVR these days. But I remember Bloom Energy on 60 Minutes and thinking, wow, this is going to be one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. And then, we're now over a decade later. And in the interim, Bloom had come up on certain screeners I'd run, especially for busted IPOs. That's one of the areas I really like looking at. But now, you're giving it some sort of tangibility. Like, what do you think took Bloom so long? Do you think it was just a solution in search of a problem, and now data centers presented that problem for them?
So I actually don't know the history of Bloom as well as to understand, other than its specific perfect use case right now, right? Yes, I know they've always been a battery storage solution provider. They've always been, but I think the thing that you have to think about more than anything else is it's really nice to have some batteries and it's clean and all that, but where do the economics make this crossover work, right? You have to have a clear market leading solution that makes the economics of it different, right? And I think that that's been a big constraint in their penetration of their potential product, right? But now we have AI. AI is the perfect thing, specifically on the lifetime and the value of your GPUs, because the value of your GPUs or accelerator vastly, vastly, vastly outweigh the shell that it's in. You can spend $1 billion on maybe not $1 billion. I don't have the numbers directly off the top of my head, but like you can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on your shell and they pale in comparison to the value of the GPUs that are inside of it. And so I think making sure to optimize and if I think in past market cycles, it wouldn't, you're buying insurance, right? You're kind of buying an ancillary service to support something else. Bloom is, right? But if the service isn't valuable enough, you can't make the dollars work, right? And this is where I think you can make the dollars work, because any people are willing to pay massive premiums in order for you to get the power online sooner. And so that is the time to market aspect, and Bloom's ability to answer that by doing some of the, being able to buy from the grid when things are off peak, being able to do on-site power generation, right? And then also just like the fact that you're able to do it in a relatively green manner, right? You do care about the sources coming in, but you can decide that later, right? Like what you plug into your data center can change massively over time. But what's really important is you need the data center to work right now, and you need to be able to hold that energy to be able to power it at extremely high uptimes. And so that's I think definitely their huge opportunity. And this is the perfect moment for them, and it's up to them being able to execute on it. Big asterisk question mark if they can do it, but I think that it's the time to market aspect of it makes it possible, and that's like the difference, right? And then not just the time to market is like, I can tell you the time to market really does matter. The market really does care about that. The people who are making the buying decisions on the other side, but the company itself, right? Like it's really important. Show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. What's the incentives of the management team now? It is to win these deals at all cost. And so that's like a perfect alignment as well. And so when you see when you see their opportunity in the market present itself, when you see the management team get incentivized for that opportunity to come true, that's when the stars align, and that's why we think it's so interesting.
Got it. Love that you're introducing us to this idea. Just to fully understand it, so are they no longer just selling the fuel cells to someone who's operating a data center? They're like actually selling a service of power storage back to, would it be like Microsoft as the customer?
I believe so. So I think it's specifically focused on the grid side. AEP, this AEP deal is like the sign of things to come.
I
They
see.
had an agreement to purchase up to a gigawatt of solid state fuel cells from Bloom. Okay. And this would the deal would double the total fuel cell capacity of Bloom, obviously big deal. But these fuel cells, AEP specifically plans to use these to power data centers, right? And so the grid is broken. And so how do you kind of like be able to slosh the power buckets around? The grid operators need this in order for them to do it. And so I think their focus is probably interfacing directly with the grids themselves. But I think in the future, behind the meter is going to become this increasingly important part of the story. So would I be surprised if they did a behind the meter deal with a large customer? No, not at all. I think behind the meter is something to watch, right? There's definitely some rumors and rumblings of some really interesting behind the meter deals to come. The Talon Amazon deal, for example, was a perfect example of like the type, and obviously that's being bogged down with giant amounts of regulation, and we'll see if it happens or not, blah, 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 blah. But that's a really important. It might be the most important, incremental new power demand driver. And so, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some kind of deal where, like as these hyperscalers are becoming such large parts of the grids, they have to kind of go and make their own infrastructure that kind of coexist with. And there's actually a really good analogy based on history. The hyperscalers did this actually with telecom networks. Like, in the beginning, they kind of used the telecom networks of the historical interconnects between telecom itself. But as they started to buy more and more and more capacity and equipment, it used to be that telecom was 80-90% of the purchasing power of networking equipment companies. But now hyperscalers are like 50-60% of the purchasing anyways. So you kind of see this thing where they originally lean on the existing infrastructure, but as they become such a large percentage of the infrastructure, they start to do things themselves because might as well, right? Like if you are purchasing it for yourself, you have your own uptime and all this kind of stuff. But on top of it is you can make the math work, and you can make it, by doing it all direct, you can generalize savings instead of like cutting out middlemen and people who, make rent along the way. So yeah, I think that this will probably be the next generation, right? Like it's kind of odd to see the hyperscalers kind of continue to grow up in this way. It's very capital intensive, obviously, and these businesses have become much more capital intensive than the past. But you can argue they've made their own telecom networks. They've made their own. Now they're going to be making their own power grids. In some ways, the level of infrastructure at the hyperscalers is this like physical advantage that's very hard for them. Very hard for other people to take out. Kind of think of it like the railroad companies in a lot of ways, right? They own the rails themselves, and the capex that they spend is what keeps the trains on top of them theirs. So yeah.
And I think, speaking of the capex, one area I wanted to cover, albeit briefly, the semi-capital equipment companies. Different area of capex, but like you've had this provocative thesis on the end of lithography, right? I think it's super interesting. Like, do you think it's the end, or is this just a pause? And is ASML the special company that a lot of generalists have come to believe that it is, or do you think there are certain like challenges for them on the horizon?
They're a special company. Okay, I'm not going to say they're an unspecial company, but I think the focus is like undue. If that makes sense. It takes a village. It takes tens of thousands of steps to make a semiconductor, and I think one of the and so it's not the end of lithography. I call it peak litho. Okay, and to be clear, like when I say peak litho, it's as a percentage, and it's not going from like it was like 30, and these numbers aren't like perfectly correct. It was like let's say 30% of the total spending Will it go to high 20s? Almost assuredly. Maybe we'll go to mid 20s, probably. But is that the end of litho? Is litho going to zero? Most definitely not. But I do think that where you get yourself in trouble, and I've been kind of bearish on ASML for quite some time, and I think it's finally coming true, and you're watching the litho thesis happen, right? And because like you literally Google ASML and they're like no brainer monopoly, like it's a obvious stock, right? But it's like no, they're losing the share of wallet, and you should think about the big picture of history. Litho was a small percentage of the spending budget for a long time. Okay, like actually before, like in the 2010s, litho was actually the share donor for the longest time. Like it went from 50% of I want to say like 15 to even 11. So you had this, you see the history where it wasn't that way, where it wasn't it wasn't the biggest line item, right? It went from 15 to 11. Okay. Obviously, EUV is a transformational technology. EUV demanded more of the spend, and this is something I think a lot about. And like I'm sure you like in our interactions together, like this is something that colors how I think about everything. Is that like transformational moments, like strategic inflection points, if we're going to steal like the Grove language of it, are the most important thing. And so you had this obvious, huge strategic inflection point where we went from DUV to EUV. EUV was the way that it went forward. And so, of course, it took a huge part of the boat. And then, of course, revenue accelerates, all this stuff. Everyone tells, hey, it's a monopoly. It is a monopoly, right? And then, as that happens, I think the generalist take has just increase, right? Like the assumption is everything is going to get better forever at its peak multiple. That's dangerous. That's bad. And I think it's like, I feel almost like responsible. Like, I was like an OG ASML bull. Like truly, I screamed at anyone who listened to me in 2018 that ASML was like the most obvious thing. And it like goes on to be like one of the most like the best large cap tech stories. But I think you have to realize the context of history, right? The next generation is all about things that are not litho constrained. It's about lowering the cost of litho in the steps of making a chip. Because litho steps are so expensive. If that's a constraint in terms of cost and you don't want these chips to be infinitely expensive, what are you trying to do? You're trying to use technology to abate that spend and that cost. And so what like the Sculpta tool is almost the Sculpta tool, which is like the applied materials tool, is a tool specifically built to just cut one layer of EUV out, because you can spend $10 million so you don't have to use your $300 million tool, and if the entire space is focused on trying to use less EUV tools, it's telling you that the constraints are changing, and next generation and gate all around, it's much more about different technologies. ALD, which is ASMI, that's ASM International, very confusing. They actually were once the same company a long time ago. You can lam to a certain extent in ALD, isotropic etch, which is like a specific type of etch technology that not only goes down but sideways. It's how you kind of carve the channels of gate all around to make a transistor on all sides. And so you look at the history of technology, and I'll even argue packaging. Packaging is this huge new, probably the biggest vector of innovation going forward. You look at how we improve, and the big technological inflections is what will make the big market share shifts and what will make big multiple differences. And so what I think the peak litho story, and why I'm like, definitely pounding my drums on, is that story is over. It's changing. Things are different. And people take that and they're like, no, this monopoly will continue to do well forever. They'll take more and more share forever. And the answer is no, it will not. And so does that mean ASML is a bad stock at a certain price? Definitely not, right? But does that mean it's rational and sane to assume it takes a larger share of the total pie? Definitely not. Anyone who is focused on this stuff deeply can tell you, it's not going up as a percentage of spend anymore, right? And equity specifically is very, very focused on the incrementals. And like, I don't know, like I'm not going to like fight philosophy and how you think about stocks. Everyone thinks about things differently, but incrementals really do rule everything around me, right? Like if you have a business making better incremental margins with incrementally taking share and the multiple goes up, that's how you have a home run. Now, if you have a business that has its peak multiple it's ever been, with a lot of people who think it's like, going to go up and right to the forever as a percentage of spending, Meanwhile, that's not true. That's a dangerous situation. So I think the thing that I'm really focused on the peak litho thing is like it's going to relatively lose share. But does that mean it loses share at 10% a year? No, it will slowly attrit share as the rest of the bucket catches up. And you can look at history and you can point definitively to the past where it wasn't 30% of the spend. It was actually 11% of the spend. Now, is it going to go back to 11? No. But is it going to go back to the 20s? Most definitely, right? And so that's the peak litho thesis simplified.
I love that you tied the technical to the valuation to the investment setup, and I think that's super interesting, and it's a big part of why I like tapping into your brain. So I had a couple closing questions to ask. I almost feel bad asking the first of my two, given I think what you've just stated above with ASML is a fairly bold prediction, but like, what are your boldest predictions for the semiconductor industry over the next 5 to 10 years? I feel like I got to ask it anyway.
Oh man. We'll just use litho as one of them. I feel like that's an easy one, right?
Totally fair. I accept that.
I don't even think that's that bold, to be honest with you. I okay, so I think the one that I don't think it's that bold but I just think that investors are just like not as focused on it as it should be. So I just like wrote this year-end outlook, and I kind of was like not the most bullish on semicap I've ever been, and I've been like a pretty big bull historically. Um, I think, I think the next 5 years for semicap is going to be about Chinese competition. In the last 5 years, it's been about how much can China buy. I think in the next 5 years, it'll be how much can China build. And I think that this I'm going to put into even larger perspective. I think China is still freaking underappreciated in the semiconductor world. I cannot explain this enough. And this is like, I went on a podcast with Dylan onto Odd Lots to try to like psyop fear into investors and people and policy makers and to people to understand how big of a deal it is. Like, I think that over and over and over, if you give and if you have a competitor who doesn't really care about economics quite as you do, and they really care about the lowest cost to the state in aggregate, and they're willing to eat the cost of it, and it's extremely not measurable. I think that the technology curves China will continue to climb, will continue to shock the crap out of the United States, and I think that we just have constantly been blindsided by it. Like, I really think the cars are a perfect example, right? You have the CEO of Ford saying, "I do not want to give up my high-end Chinese EV because it's so good." And people are still like, "Oh no, it's a low quality thing," or "Oh no, it's just like solar where they dumped supply." And the reality is we see this happen over and over and over again, where it's like, okay, new technology, China is filled with people who are very smart, lots of labor, a huge deep technical talent pool, extremely STEM focused. And what will happen is they can climb the technology curve, and they can shock they continue to shock the heck out of the United States. And I feel like we just keep getting blindsided when I'm like, come on, like, pay attention. It's very obvious. Like, and the one I think that is very obvious to me, and it will continue to be, is semi-cap tools, right? Like, tools was this like golden thing that we can use to control China because we had such a strong percentage control of, and it's so technical, and it was going to take quite a time to breach that moat. That moat is being breached today. I really like, they buy all these tools, and like there's let's just say 1,000 steps. I think it depends on the process, but there's thousands of steps in making a semiconductor. And some of the steps are easier than the others. And I think that there is denial that some of the steps won't be taken over. And it's clear that they already are. And so I think that that's like I feel like it's like so lame, because it's like the prediction is something that's already happening, and I can point to you, and maybe that's why it's a good prediction, but I can point to you examples where it's already kind of happened. The SMIC, no, yeah, sorry, not SMCI, SMIC, not node process, the N+2, is like the most amazing process ever. Like, if you think about it, like the timeline is they shipped a transistor that was as dense as Intel did. Like I want to say like a year and a half after them. I don't know what the exact timing is, but it's like pretty similar. So like Intel, the guys who literally invented lithography and in making semiconductors is barely behind a company who is constraints where they're not allowed to use tools from America. Like they're not allowed to use the best. So imagine if like it would be like if I'm trying to use like a good analogy and maybe like sports or something. If someone shows up and the best biker in the world or one of the former best bikers in the world barely beats this guy who started 3 years ago with like completely no brand with like a worse bike, and it's not even repaired and no one's even talking to them, and Intel only beat them by 5 seconds, and next year the next race their Intel's going to be slower. If the constraints were gone, if China could buy all the tools that the United States let them, I think China would have a surprisingly good chip. They would be better than Samsung and Intel, who are both struggling in different ways. And that to me is like the encapsulation of the story to come. That is, I feel like it's not that bold, but I think that the technology curves they'll continue to climb will shock us over and over and over and over again. I'm going to guess in the next 5 years that something will happen that is like so shocking and surprising. Like let's say they have like an extremely high-end chip, like a high-end like HBM I've been surprised by them getting around the HBM stuff. Maybe like a isotropic etch tool, or maybe like a DUV tool or something like that. I mean, DUV definitely seems like the furthest away, but like one of these tools that are extremely hard to do, and we thought, yeah, no one's going to ever breach that moat, and they do. And I think that's like the spicy semiconductor future take. And I think that, just like everything, people are not updating their priors even close to fast enough. So, I mean, I feel like my priors are not fast enough, and I feel like I keep updating them faster and faster and faster. So,
Well, that is an interesting, spicy take. Definitely something I'd not have anticipated coming from you, but I love it. And so for the very last question, the last thing I feel like I have to ask, because you said, every analyst should be using AI. I'd love to hear if you had one or two slam dunk ways you'd recommend analysts use AI in their own workflow.
I really like the book LLM. It's probably my favorite. Like, I really wish, and I think maybe they did finally get a freaking mobile app, but like, I love the stupid podcast thing. I do like, look, some new regulation comes out. There's only so much time you have, and there's only so many Tigis calls you can read. There's only so much something you can do, and I think it's not going to make you a genius or the axe on the story, but it will ramp you up infinitely faster than you ever knew was possible. So I did like a little bit of a dive on nuclear power. Obviously, the space went hyperbolic, so I didn't exactly get to like write about stocks or ideas in the space. But did I download all of the DOE regulations into a single Notebook LM instance? Yes. Did I make me podcast after podcast for specific aspects of it? Yes. Did I have it like, could I be like, okay, well, can you explain why XYZ, this reactor type is better than this reactor type? What changed it, right? Like I uploaded literally books and books and books of information. And I think that that's really helpful. Like, actually a good example, it's definitely far off from being able to write, but like, okay, so I made like a year-end post, right? You kind of do that as a newsletter writer. And I just uploaded every single thing I wrote for the entire year into a single 917-page PDF. Okay. And then I asked, hey, what do you like? What are some of the big themes? What are this? And you can kind of talk to yourself. Like that's literally my own past work. I try to get it to write in my style. Obviously, it definitely can't do that. But like, you can interact with large bodies of work that are way too big for your puny little mind to comprehend. I think humans are still faster single-threaded vehicles, but you definitely can't read 900 pages of everything you wrote last year into a single document and be able to ping and query things back, right? That's awesome. And so, maybe a good example is, you're coming up on a company and you are trying to do some research. Like what I used to do, read the presentation on the website, maybe a few of the last transcripts and like maybe an initiation report. Throw that all into a thing, and then into like a single notebook LM instance. You can make it have a little freaking podcast, which is just so much more easier to consume. And then you can kind of get to that level of mastery a lot quicker, and you don't have to read as much, right? I know that's like, I feel like that's a cop out, but you can still read, you can still learn. You think about all of that excess time that you have that you didn't have to spend to do the initial dive, and you can ask question after question after question to understand like what's the actual story going on there, to then reinvest that into more research, right? And so it's a time saving tool. You can go up the curve so much quicker, and I feel like you have to. One of my friends has been using deep research. I've been very interested in that. I haven't had the opportunity to play along with it, but yeah, I think Notebook LM is my favorite one right now.
I love that shout out. I've been getting value out of it as well. And I think, nice little hack that you had, getting around the 30 document limit by creating one super long PDF. Well, I hope everyone stayed till the very end, because that's a bit of gold there. And thank you so much, Doug, for joining us. This has been incredible. Learned so much through the whole conversation. And we covered a really wide range of topics. You did it in a pretty fast fashion. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's nice talking to you. And yeah, I feel like I have to have 1 second to plug SemiAnalysis. I'm definitely part of the SemiAnalysis thing. Like we're trying to be the best that's ever been in semiconductors and AI. I think we are already there. If you're interested, I definitely think you should reach out to us, sales@semianalysis.com. Like we have many different ways to work with many different people. Obviously I have to pitch the thing I'm a part of, but yeah, I think we're doing something really, really, really special there. And obviously I write fabricatedknowledge.com, but you should definitely check out SemiAnalysis.com. It's very dense, but I don't think there's a better resource for like relatively cheap information on the entire internet. I mean, so yeah, definitely should check those places out, especially if you're interested in all these kinds of things. Like whether from a generalist perspective, definitely think my newsletters may be a little better perspective on that, but even getting to the nitty gritty details, people who actually are in the space themselves use it as a reference material, SemiAnalysis, that is. And yeah, I think that what we're doing is extremely special. And if you have any interest in it, you are probably behind if you are not paying attention to us already. So definitely think you should consider that when you're thinking about semiconductors and AI and data centers and stuff like that. So
absolutely. That's how I've stayed up to speed on the entire space myself. It's been incredibly valuable, even investing in areas beyond semis and understanding some of the implications and consequences for the hyperscalers and software companies themselves. So couldn't agree more.
Thanks for letting me have my pitch. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for having me on. It was really good talking to you, Elliot. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and stay safe out there, and however that looks like, and have a good day.
Absolutely. Take care, Doug.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.